Good evening. We welcome you to this evening and our worship and our study time together. I hope you've had a good afternoon. I hope now you will join us as we stand and sing, "Come Thou Fount, Come Thou King." It'll be projected. So would you join us as we stand and as we sing and as we worship? Would you join us? Join us now as we welcome and fellowship with each other.
As you guys are making your ways back to your seats, we'll take your prayer concerns this evening. And so share with us your prayer concerns that you have. Genesis chapter 8. I guess you need to add your pastor to that list, because I had a deacon this week come into my office and had the gall to introduce himself to me as if I hadn't been here in 2 weeks. And I told Rob Childers I'd go visiting with him anyway on Tuesday. He come in and said, "Hey, my name's Rob Childers. I'm one of the deacons here." I said, "Hey, I'm the new pastor here at the church." So I won. You know better than that. The youth did very well. I think they're still adding up numbers, totaling up, but okay. They made made $4,800. So that's good. So that'll go a long ways towards the youth going to Caswell. That'll buy them enough gas to get to the other side of Hickory. So, who won? I don't know what. The Carswell family. Carswell family. So it was a beautiful day, a great time of fellowship, and everybody had a good time. And I'll tell you, not only is one of the deacons, one of our senior deacons on the deacon board right now, harassing the pastor, but that young spunk of a youth pastor had the gall yesterday to say, "You look awful refreshed after half a month off." And I started laughing. I said, I hope so. He said, "I thought you're the one that's part-time now, not me." And I was like, man. Misty said, I'm glad he feels comfortable enough to pick at you and stuff. I said, "Yeah, I'm firing him tomorrow." No, he's, but no, we had a great time yesterday at the golf tournament, and thank you to everybody who sponsored holes and put teams together, and especially the ones that didn't laugh at our team as we were playing. But we had a good time. So. Yeah, he did. Gene had 4 generations playing with him yesterday, and so we had a good time yesterday for sure. Well, tonight we are continuing in our study of Genesis. We're in Genesis chapter 8. Very grateful that 2 weeks ago, when I was quarantining because of exposure to COVID, that Lee stepped in and taught for me, and really started talking about the flood and the timeline of the flood. And tonight we will pick up looking at some more of the timeline of the flooding, the time, not so much the flood arriving, but the actual water being covered, or the earth being covered by water. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to read Genesis chapter 8, and then we're going to go back and sort of talk about it as we go through our study. So if you would follow along in your copy of the scriptures, and we'll begin in Genesis chapter 8, beginning with verse 1. It says, "But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark. And he sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded. Now the springs of the deep and the floodgates of the heavens had been closed, and the rain had stopped falling from the sky. The water receded steadily from the earth. At the end of the 150 days, the water had gone down. And on the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The waters continued to recede until the 10th month. On the first day of the 10th month, the tops of the mountains became visible. After 40 days, Noah opened a window he had made in the ark and sent out a raven, and it kept flying back and forth until the water had dried up from the earth. Then he sent out a dove to see if the water had receded from the surface of the ground. But the dove could find nowhere to perch, because there was water over all the surface of the earth. So it returned to Noah in the ark. He reached out his hand and took the dove and brought it back to himself in the ark. He waited 7 more days and again sent out the dove from the ark. When the dove returned to him in the evening, there in its beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. Then Noah knew that the water had receded from the earth. He waited 7 more days and sent the dove out again, but this time it did not return to him. By the first day of the first month of Noah's 601st year, the water had dried up from the earth. Noah then removed the covering from the ark and saw that the surface of the ground was dry. By the 27th day of the second month, the earth was completely dry. Then God said to Noah, "Come out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons and their wives. Bring out every kind of living creature that is with you, the birds, the animals, and all the creatures that move along the ground, so they can multiply on the earth and be fruitful and increase in number on it." So Noah came out together with his sons and his wife and his sons' wives, all the animals and all the creatures that move along the ground, and all the birds, everything that moves on the land came out of the ark, one kind after another. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking some of all the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, "Never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease." And so as we read that, there is a lot happening here. There's a lot of dates and months and times and things like that. And in this point of the story of the flood, as I said a moment ago, we're reading more about the actual flooding or the water covering the surface of the earth rather than the waters getting onto the surface of the earth. Because in Genesis chapter 7, we read about the timeline of the flooding of the earth, and then in Genesis chapter 8, we read about how long the waters covered the earth and about the waters receding. And so when we read in verse 1, what is the odd thing that jumps out to you when you read verse 1 there? What's the first thing that sort of jumps out at you that's kind of a little different, something you might not expect when it comes to God? That he remembered, right? And so we read that God remembered Noah and the animals in the ark and Noah's family. And so the question we ask is that if God is remembering Noah, did God forget about Noah? And, that would be the question. What do you think is meant by God remembered? What do you think that means? Okay, that there was a point in time that the situation with the flood had progressed to, and it was time for things to happen. And you're really, really close to what answer we're looking for, because one commentary puts it this way, says, "To remember, as it is used in Scripture, is not merely to recall to mind, it is to express concern and care for someone." And so what we see in this moment is not so much that God remembered because he had forgotten, because God is perfect and God cannot forget. But what we see is that because of the way God's mind works, that it was sort of like Alta said, it had come to a point where it was time for God to provide some care and provision in a special way for Noah and the animals and those in the ark. The closest way I think that I could come up with an illustration as to what happens here in Genesis 8:1 is something that I experienced this past week. For the past couple of weeks, my dad and I have been making hay, and if you ride on the tractor long enough, there's time to think and time to pray, and things like that, because you're just riding for long stretches of time. And while I remember specifically being at the farm and riding on the tractor one evening, and as I was riding, something came to mind. There in our community over there, there was a woman who is younger than I am, probably 5 or 6 years younger than I am, and her husband was killed in a boating accident a couple weeks ago. And because of some connections that we know, people we know, me and Misty have talked about it a couple times since then. But, as I was riding the tractor, this came to mind. It came to mind about this woman who's lost her husband, and it's still kind of fresh even for me with what we experienced with Misty. It's not the same, but it's enough to sort of get you. And so this came to mind, and so as I'm riding the tractor for hours on end, that evening, it came to mind several times. Now, I didn't forget that this woman had lost her husband, right? You can't forget that. But it came to mind, and so it was a matter of, it was in the forefront of my mind at that moment, and so then I would get to making sure I don't run over the electric fence or don't end up in the creek, and then, a little bit later, it might come back to mind again, and so I'd pray for the woman and the situation that they're dealing with. And so, God can't forget. Okay, we understand that God can't forget, but it's kind of interesting that God can't even let a situation like Noah in the ark, or this woman who's lost her husband, God can't let that not be the focus of his attention in that person's life. Now think of that. That sort of struck me this week, and that's hard to imagine, because if I'm up here teaching from the Bible, I'm not thinking about things at my house or things at the farm that need to be done or anything like that. I'm not thinking about those. I'm keyed in on this, and that's going to have to wait. But when it comes to God, he is intimately concerned about what's going on in Alta's life, and that is the focus of his attention just as much as it is for you and you and you, every one of us. And so he is solely focused on that, so he can't forget about us. He can't, and so when he remembers, it's as if it is there in front of him all the time, and it's, as Alta said a moment ago, it's time for him to act. Another source, or resource, I guess I should say, points out what God did after he remembered Noah and the animals, and it sort of puts it into another perspective for us. It says this, it says, when the Bible says that God remembered something, it is not implying forgetfulness. God always remembers. It is part of his nature. The statement that God remembered places an emphasis on his faithfulness and everlasting care. In each passage that says God remembered throughout the Bible, we see that the phrase is followed by some sort of action or work on behalf of God's people. And so when we read in the Bible that God remembered Noah, God remembered whatever the situation, God remembered Hannah, God remembered whatever the situation was that we read about, when we read that, it's always followed by some action where God is, as Alta mentioned a minute ago, is working on their behalf, bringing about whatever he needs to in their place. He's bringing about some action of benevolence or provision or care on his part for the one that he is remembering. And so when we think about it, God is not forgetful as we might be forgetful, but instead he is focused on each situation. And so, the same is true here with Noah, because after God remembered Noah, it says there that God sent a wind over the earth and the waters receded. It was time for God to act. It was time for God to move in Noah's life in a special way. So it's not that he forgot about Noah, like, oh, wait a minute, I forgot about this boat floating on the water with all the people and all the people and all the animals left on earth. Oh yeah, I need to do something. No, God is focused on him and now saying it's time for me to act. It's time for me to do something. And so sort of like we said, it's gotten to the point where it was time for something to happen. But from verse 2 on, we read that about the timeline of the floodwaters on the earth and them receding. Now, last week, Lee was nice enough to, in his teaching, to start sharing the dates from the Jewish calendar that would explain, give us an idea of when certain events were happening. Now, I found out this week, because I had given Lee those notes, that there is like 4 Jewish New Years, and I don't understand how it works. I can't understand how you can't have but one New Year. But I came across a really good source from a Jewish website that gave me a lot better understanding of the timeline. And so basically, when I read, there were 2 rabbis. One was from like the 1100s and one was from some other time period. That they both had put together the dates of the flood according to the Jewish calendar. But the problem is they were both 6 months apart from each other. So one was starting like what we would say in July, and the other starting in January in that time frame. And so when I had started, I was going off of the wrong dates last week. So what I have now is what I feel like are better dates for what we're looking at in chapter 8. But when we're talking about something that was 3,700 years ago almost, we're not exactly sure anyway. But the catch is that there has been some changes made to the Jewish calendar after the exile to Babylon. They started to incorporate Babylonian calendar parts into their calendar. And so we only know of the name of a few of the months before the exile on the Jewish calendar. There's only like three or four that we know what those are. And so some of these months that we're giving are those pre-exile months, but some of the others are the ones that we know of since then. So I know that's a lot to explain, that we've got some better dates to work with today. So what we read is in our last study, we talked about how the events of the flood, the waters quit churning, as it said, after 150 days on the 1st of Sivan. That's the name of the month. In the year 1656 AM. And as Lee told you last time, AM is basically, the easy way to look at it is after man is created, or after creation. But it's Anno Mundi. And the date is, this is basically 1656 years after God has created everything. And so this was when the date that you see there, the 1st of Sivan, is day 150 of the flood waters covering the earth. And so verse 2 tells us that the springs of the deep, the well springs of the deep, and the vapor canopy that we've been talking about are finished with their flooding aspects. The well springs have quit putting water onto the surface, and the vapor canopy has completely collapsed onto the earth at this point. And so the water, after the 150-day mark, is starting to recede. Because of the massive amount of water that would have been involved with the flood, it started to cut channels into the earth. It started to do things to the topography of the earth. It would have cut places like the Grand Canyon. It would have cut places like the Marianas Trench. And so that's what we see, is that this water has drastically changed the topography of the earth, and it gives us what we see today as the surface of the earth. Now, 16 days later, basically on the 17th of Sivan, we see that the ark at this point has been floating for somewhere around 6 months. I mean, just floating with no land in sight. And we're told that the ark finally comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat. And so, the ark is floating, and, many people have mistakenly said that the ark was on Mount Ararat, but the Bible clearly says the mountains of Ararat. Now, the catch here is that there are two mountains that are known as Ararat. One is Little Ararat, and the other is Greater Ararat, which is the big one. And the interesting thing about it is the mountains in that section of eastern Turkey, or western Armenia, however you want to look at it, in that Armenian region there, Mount Ararat, the Greater Ararat, goes up to almost 17,000 feet. And so we don't know what mountains the ark would have run aground on, but we know that that's what happens. And the thought that the ark settled on Mount Ararat, the tallest one, may come from something that we read in a few minutes in verse 5. But remember, the bottom of the ark would have been below the surface of the water. And if the mountains are not sticking out of the water yet, they're going to run aground. I mean, it's what's going to happen. And so they do end up hitting a mountain, and very well could have been, the larger of the two mountains there, but we just don't know. But on the 1st of Av of that month, we see that after sitting for 43 days atop a mountain in the Ararat Mountains, the water receded enough, tops of the mountains to become visible. So the mountains starting to become visible means most likely the ark had come to rest on what? The highest of mountains. So that's probably where people have gotten the idea that it was Mount Ararat that the ark come to rest on. But nevertheless, we see that there's 40 more days. So they run aground, and 43 days later, they start to see the water receding enough to see the tops of some mountains. And then it's another 40 more days between that and Noah's first attempt to try and find dry ground. So Noah's first attempt on the 10th of Elul was to send out a raven. He sends out a raven, and it didn't immediately find dry ground, but the scriptures say that it flew back and forth until the water had subsided enough or receded enough for it to land. But then we read, without any context of time between the sending of the raven and the sending of the next bird, but we see that the next bird that Noah sends out is a dove. And so he sends out this dove, and the dove couldn't find any land to perch on either, and so it comes back to Noah. Now, there's one thing to point out in the difference in the birds that Noah chose to find landing places or dry ground, and their choices of landing. What kind of bird is a raven? What's the term we would normally refer to them as? They're a scavenger, right? So they're a scavenger. Do scavengers care what they eat? No. Do they care where they land? No, they don't. Now a dove, we'll put it as politely as we know how, is kind of a prissy type of bird, right? You know, they're going to be kind of particular about what they eat. They're going to be kind of particular about where they land. And it's a vast difference between the two kinds of birds. And so we see that there is something important being shown to us here in the fact that, Noah sends out this raven just trying to find if there's any dry ground. It didn't matter what it was or where it was. Yeah, the mountaintops had been exposed, but there really wasn't anything good for the raven to land on. But the dove comes back to him. And so we'll see in a little bit that there was a little bit of a different, or he makes another attempt as we see this. And so what we do see is that the fact that the raven didn't come back and the dove did means that the earth was not ready for all of the animals to venture out of the ark. That was the key thing for them to bring from this. And even though Noah could see nothing but dry ground on tops of the mountains where he was at, the fact that the birds couldn't find anywhere to land showed him that the earth is not ready for them. And so the next date I have for you is conjecture. Okay, it's a guess based on those that have studied the scriptures. This would be the 16th of Elul, which is about 6 days later. Okay, but this date would be when Noah sent that dove out. When Noah sent the first dove out, it's believed that it was about a week between the raven going out and the dove going out the first time. And even though we're not told specifically in Scripture that that's when it happened, what we know is that by reading a little bit further in and doing the math backwards, we can sort of see that this would be about the time frame for Noah to have sent that dove out, okay? And so as we read further in, we can sort of work our way back to this. And so it's believed that it was about a week later when he sent that first dove out. And so what we see is that there's another week. He's taking it, just steps at a time, trying to figure out what's going on here with the world. But on what would have been the 23rd of Elul of that same year, Noah gave the waters that next week, and he sent the dove out for the second time. And when he sent it out, we read that when the dove returned, it carried with it an olive leaf. That it brought back a plant with it, which shows that the world is, all but ready for the animals, because that meant that trees were exposed and meant that they were even closer to being able to leave the ark. But I want you to notice something. The year that we're talking about here is the year 1656. Elul is the last month of the Jewish calendar, okay, in the cycle of New Year's that seems to be the right one for the flood. But the next date that we're given in the Bible is the first day of the first month of the year, which would be the first of Tishri in the year 1657. And so they have been on the ark for a really long time. They've been in the ark since the second month of 1656. So they have been in there a long time. And so what we see is that a couple of things happen on this date, on the first of the year for them. The first thing we see is that Noah sends out a dove for the third time in verse 12. And this time the dove does not return. It doesn't come back to the ark, meaning that the ground, the plants, the trees, everything should be ready for animals. And so not only that, we're told in verse 13 that the water had dried up, that the water was gone from the surface of the earth. And so Noah makes preparations for releasing the animals from the ark. And it's kind of interesting that it says, let me find the verse there. I think it's verse 14. No, verse 13. It says, by the first day of the first month, which is the first of Tishri, of Noah's 601st year, the water had dried up from the earth. Noah then removed the covering from the ark and saw the surface of the ground was dry. What do you think is the covering of the ark? What do you think that might be? Some translations use a different word for covering. What's another translation you might have that says something different? Okay. Some translations use the term skin. And so if you think about the skin of the ark, what would be the skin of the ark or the covering of the ark? It would be the outer layer of the ark. And so one thing I read this week that makes the most sense to me for what probably happened was that Noah started to disassemble the ark. And what he did was he took off some of the outer layers of the ark in certain areas, and that would have served a couple of purposes. One thing I read was that it would have provided ventilation for Noah and the animals, because I really want to check this out at the Ark Encounter. I've not got to go there yet, but it talked about a moon pool that would have helped with the circulation of air inside of the ark during the flood, but without the water and the effects of the water on the boat, they no longer had the same kind of ventilation system working in the ark. So you needed to ventilate that place with all those animals and, all of the things that the animals would leave behind them and all that sort of stuff. And so taking off the outer layers of the ark would have served the purpose of ventilation. But something else that it mentioned was that would have given Noah a resource for building the exit ramps from the ark, because he would have needed to get the animals off of the ark, and he would have had to have built something and had to find lumber from somewhere. So that would be the most readily available source there. And so, when they start to take off the covering of the ark, they are going to be in the ark for another 5 weeks. So more than a month, they're still going to be in there. So they need that ventilation, and it gives them time to build the ramps and things that they would need to do. And although the ground was dry at this point, there would still be need for time for the grass and the forage plants to grow so that they would support the animals as they come off. Now, the last date that we have in chapter 8 is the 27th of Keshvan in that same year. And verse 14 says, by the 27th day, which is the 27th of Keshvan, of the second month, the earth was completely dry. And so Noah and his family had spent a year and 10 days. They went in on the second day, or they went in on the 17th day of the second month of the year before. So they were in the ark for an entire year. And so they have been in there from the time the first rains fell until the earth was completely dry. And in verses 15 through 19, we find God giving Noah and his family instructions for disembarking from the ark with the animals. And they were to release the animals so that they could go and fill the earth again. And, something that I thought about when I read about, Noah building the ramps and having to get the animals off of the ark, I sort of wondered if the animals coming off the ark acted like my cows do when I move them from one field to the other. Terry, when you move a cow from one field to the other and they get into the field, do they just keep going and looking for other grass? They stop right there. You almost have to sometimes push the gate and push them into the field, because when they get to the grass, they just stop and they start eating. And it's just that's the way cattle are anyway. Then I wonder if those animals are coming off of the ark and there's a backlog of animals. They're like, you got to keep going, keep trying to move them on so that they would spread out and not act like cows do a lot of times. But nevertheless, they get them off of the ark, and in verse 20, we read about a tremendous step of faith on Noah's part, because what he did was he builds an altar so that he can make a sacrifice to God. And the only catch is there are limited numbers of clean and unclean animals on the earth at this time. There are no others anywhere else on earth other than the ones Noah is letting off of the ark. And in this moment, he has a limited number of animals that can be used for food, for them to reproduce and be, breeding stock, and not only that, for sacrificial worship. So in this moment of having just got off of the ark, Noah has to trust God with the future of animals and for himself, and provision for himself and his family to be able to eat and do all of those things. And it says he was taking some of all the clean animals and clean birds, and he sacrificed them in worship to God. You got a handful of cattle or sheep or lambs, and you're going to step out in faith and trust that God's going to provide, and you sacrifice them to God. That's exactly what Noah did. And the sacrifice that he gave, probably because of his trust in God, and God could see Noah's heart and the fact that he was trusting God so implicitly and so deeply, it moved God. It moved the heart of God. And what that did was, as we read there at the end of chapter 8, it began to lay the groundwork for the covenant that comes in chapter 9, that as we see, what will happen is that God is starting to make some promises. And it's fulfilled, or it comes to completion in the covenant that we read about in chapter 9, because we see that God first promised to never curse the ground again because of humans. And then he goes on to promise that he would never destroy all living creatures again. And then we'll see next time how he wraps that all together in the covenant that is signified by the rainbow. But as we close out our study, one of the things that we always talk about is the first. We talk about what we find in this particular chapter that is the first for humanity or mankind or the Bible or whatever it may be. And the one that we see here is this is the first promise from God in the Bible. The first time that we see a legitimate promise from God that he's going to act on behalf of mankind in some special way. It's in verse 21 there, where God is making these promises. And so that's the only first that we see here as far as the book of Genesis goes. Now, the other way that we close out our studies each week is by looking at what God saw was good, what we can find as the good in that particular chapter. And the good we find in Genesis chapter 8 has to do with God having a process for redemption. Because there was a method to the process that Noah endured for more than a year with his family inside of that ark. The timelines that we have looked at for the last 2 weeks have pointed to the fact that God had a process and a plan for redeeming mankind through Noah's family. And there were set times when certain things would occur. There were certain lengths of time that things had to last. And there was a method to God's way of redeeming the earth through this cataclysmic flood. Now, when we look at how God works in our own lives, we usually feel like Noah did on the ark, wondering on day 137, how many more days is the water going to be on the earth? He had no way of knowing that it would be 150 days, but after 75 days or 68 days or how many ever days, he's got to be wondering, man, I've already marked off all these days on the wall, and What's the process? A lot of times that's how we feel when we watch God working in our lives. We feel like Noah, watching the process, but not knowing the big picture, so to speak. And so we don't know the set times when things will occur in our lives. We don't know the length of time that certain things will last in our lives. And what we experience is in the moment without a view of that bigger picture. So we're sort of taking it, snapshot at a time. But the process God puts us and others through for our redemption is exactly that. It's a process. It's not something that instantaneously happens in that regard. God works through the process to bring us where we need to be. Now, we don't know how long God will work in the life of one of our children or a spouse or a friend or a neighbor or a co-worker before that person puts their faith in Him. We don't know how God will orchestrate the events of that person's life to draw them closer to Him in preparation for salvation. What we can trust is that God has a plan. God has a method to the madness, so to speak, that we seem to look at it and just see a bunch of jumbled pieces. God has a method for accomplishing that redemption in someone's life. And so we may not see it in the moment because we have a very limited view of the entire picture. But when we are done counting the days like Noah would have been, we can look back and see how God used every one of those moments to work in that situation. And so we can trust that God's going to bring about His plan in the way that it needs to happen. And so that's our study of Genesis chapter 8 tonight. And so are there any questions before we close up shop for tonight? Any questions? Mm-hmm. Right. I hadn't thought about that. If you didn't hear David, what he's saying was the amount of time that God took from the time the mountaintop started to be exposed and the water started to drain out, that God brought about the regeneration of the plants and things on the earth in a expedited fashion. That it was a much faster, obviously not spoken, created type situation like we read about in Genesis 1 and 2, but He brought about the plants and stuff coming back in a much quicker fashion than they would normally have done after all plant life on earth would have essentially been killed by the flood. And so we see that He did work. It's something that we miss a lot of times, is that it's only been a matter of weeks, a couple of months at most, and since the water started to drain, and then they see this olive leaf in the mouth of the dove. So that's a miracle that we definitely miss. Any other questions?
I can see where Moses, Noah might have when it rains for several days, my patience is a little longer than Susan's because we're just going to stop.
It might be because she's wanting you to get out of the house.
Cabin fever is what I'm thinking about.
Right.
I don't know many in here that don't complain after a couple of days.
Oh yeah, for sure. I couldn't imagine 40 days, and then when you look outside, everything's covered with water. I mean, it'd be amazing. Any other questions? All right. One question that we had last week, or last time, that that Lee mentioned was, because I wasn't here, was what happened to the fish, during the flood. And the general understanding is that because they don't have the breath of life, as in land dwelling, they were okay during the water. Now, you would ask the question, well, what about those that are saltwater versus freshwater? I don't have an answer for that, but that. Well, it says that everything with the breath of life in it, and fish don't take. I'm gonna have to quit letting Lee teach. No, no. I read a few things. Right. Right. The things that I read pertaining to what happened to fish was that because they were not land-dwelling animals or required land like birds do and things, that they were fine because of the water. Now, my right. Well, I think that it was, I think probably from the context, it's probably pointing to the fact that everything on dry land, even though it doesn't, like you said, even though it doesn't categorize it, I think it goes back to the fact that that was the understood from what other things were being said. It could have just been just a generalization rather than the breakdown like we were talking about. But no, I think that's the difference there, is that it was more of just a reminder that everything on earth had died without, or everything on dry land without making the categories mentioned there. And so, any other questions before we wrap up? Mm-hmm. They, the probably the answer to that is that the water cycle that we know of now, that it rains, it eventually goes back out to the ocean, it evaporates, and turns into a cloud again. That process wouldn't have been in place because, like the rivers in the Garden of Eden, they were already placed there. So there could have been, because the well springs of the earth that break forth for the flood, they could have easily have maintained those rivers without the need for evaporation. And we don't know what the atmosphere would have been like before the flood with this vapor canopy that would have been around the earth. We don't know what need there would have been for evaporation to continue the water cycle and things like that, or if the way the vapor canopy was around the earth, if that maintained it in a completely foreign way that we just don't know about. Most likely, my guess, without having read anything on it, would be that the well springs of the earth would have probably have maintained those rivers without the water cycle as we know it today. That would be my answer off the cuff. But I'll see if I can find something, find us an answer for that. That's a good question. I've never thought about I thought more about how were plants watered before the flood, before rain? By the dew, and that's what it tells us in the scriptures. And so there had to have been some form of a water cycle, although it would have been different than what we know it to be today. And so let me see if I can find us an answer on that, about where the rivers would have been sourced and how they would have been maintained for almost 2 millennia, because that's a long time to go without having the water cycle that we have in place today. So I'll see if I can find us an answer on that one. That's a good question. Any others?